They're getting ready to start. Hold on.
Welcome everyone to the Rotary Club of Flint. Today is October 8th, 2021. The honorary bell ringer for October 8th is Dunk the Vote founder Ron Bell. Dunk the Vote is a Boston-based voting rights and voting advocacy campaign, and Mr. Bell and his group have registered over 50,000 people to vote in the greater Boston area in the last 20 years. And I thought that he was a great honorary bell ringer because our speaker, Paul Brzezicki, is going to talk to us about voting rights. And so I thought having a voting rights activist was a great honorary bell ringer for today's meeting. Next week, I'll get to ring the real bell. This will be fun. Let's start our meeting with the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance
to the flag
of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands,
one nation,
under God,
indivisible,
with liberty and justice for all.
And the four-way test of the things we think, say, or do.
Is it the truth? Is it fair to all concerned? Will it build goodwill and better friendships? And will be beneficial to all concerned?
Today's inspirational message is my next door neighbor, one house over, growing up, Mr. Richard Gibbs.
Good afternoon, fellow Rotarians. An inspiration can motivate one to take a positive action. When the opportunity to encourage someone to take action or make a change, just do it. Encourage them. I have previously made a presentation to the club describing visiting a member of my Vietnam infantry unit who sustained traumatic amputations of his arms and legs, plus the loss of an eye. A quad amputee since 16 November 1970. Last year, on the 50th anniversary of that tragic event, Lloyd Cantor's wife, Loretta, his sole caregiver, organized a surprise Zoom reunion with the men who saved Lloyd's life. Loretta also invited the Army chaplain that went to Lloyd's bedside the day after he was wounded. The chaplain remained with Lloyd for several days until Lloyd was flown to Japan, then onward to the United States for long-term care. The chaplain and Lloyd have kept in touch for all these years, becoming lifelong friends, but the rest of us had never met Chaplain Shelley Lewis until the Zoom session last November. During the course of our session, one of the men asked, "Chaplain, how do you remember the details of being with Lloyd 50 years ago?" Shelley went off screen and reappeared with a large file box which contained all the letters he had written to his wife during the year he served in Vietnam. A comment was made by one of the veterans and then emphasized by another. "Rabbi, you need to write a book about your experiences." Shelley accepted our encouragement. Quoting Rabbi Lewis, "The impact of that reunion 50 years later awakened a flood of memories for me. It was then that I decided to write about my year as a chaplain in Vietnam. There were so many encounters and experiences that now seemed worthy of sharing. Lloyd's tragedy and his determination to live were perhaps the most dramatic and heart-wrenching of my year of service in Vietnam. The result, a very well-written book titled Letters Home, a Jewish Chaplain's Vietnam Memoir." A noteworthy comment. Rabbi Lewis has sent copies of his book all the rabbinical schools in the United States that train Jews to become rabbis. His objective, to inspire just a few new rabbis to become military chaplains. I'll close with this very positive comment. Rabbi Lewis has organized a surprise Zoom party for the Cantors and the men who saved Lloyd's life almost 51 years ago. The Zoom party will celebrate Lloyd and Loretta Cantor's 50th wedding anniversary this Sunday, October 10th.
Wow, thank you. I can't, as I hear you say that, I see the theme for this year, Serve to Change Lives, and I can't think of a better example of serving to change lives. Thank you very much. A historical note, this week in Michigan history, on October 5th, 1835, voters approved Michigan's first state constitution. Fun fact, most people in the state don't realize we have a state constitution, of course, along with the US Constitution. If that date, 1835, to you seems odd, knowing that Michigan was admitted to the Union in 1837, there was a 15-month delay after we had adopted our state constitution before we were admitted, and that was because of the dispute around the Toledo Strip and how that would get resolved and where our state's borders would be at. So our state constitution was adopted on this week a long time ago. Paul Rosicki would not be telling us about that now. It's a little bit prior to Paul's time. Under announcements, you hopefully are aware that next Friday, I definitely hope Connie is aware, at the food bank, the next Friday is our first hybrid meeting where we will have the in-person and virtual option available. It will be the same link on the Zoom. The meeting obviously will include a meal, so it'll be a little bit longer. So if you're joining on Zoom and want to just hear the speaker, you can sign on later. But if you want to join at the beginning of the meeting and hear kind of the opening program, you can do that as well. One thing to note as you come in, just to be prepared, our flow of traffic is going to be a little bit different. When you come in the main doors, instead of walking to the far end and then coming back along the table, you're going to kind of go along the table as you're coming in, and then we'll go into the room on the far door, get your food, and then sit down. So kind of a little bit different order of operations to prevent some of the backlog and have a little bit more of a flow. And then also our cost, we're going to just have it be $20. And that will include your $2 of your raffle. And if you'd like not to partake in the raffle, you can just leave that as a $2 contribution back to the club's charitable efforts. So it's not an actual increase if you were paying lunch and the raffle, but just makes it a little bit faster, not have to do the $2 change for everyone and then give the money back for the raffle tickets. So those are the main things. And of course, and we'll have this as part of the weekly message going forward, but you've seen this around town and we all know this. If you're not feeling well, if you believe that you have been in contact with someone who's tested positive, if you think you have symptoms potentially of COVID, or you just don't feel well, that's another reason why we have the Zoom options, and we'd love to have you join us virtually. But please be mindful of our health situations. I think we're all aware of that these days as we're out and about. But we will have just some of those screening questions for you in the weekly message, just as a reminder that if you're not feeling well or you think you've been around in contact with someone who may have had COVID, to please stay home and stay safe. I don't know that there are any other announcements. Are there any updates for good and welfare? It's good to see you all. I know I've been gone for a couple of weeks, and so it's good for me to see you on the Zoom here. Are there any guests to be welcomed? Didn't see any. All right. So in that case, that'll take me to the speaker introduction. And Jerry Hill, I'm going to do the introduction for Paul Rosicki because I have his bio here right in front of me. So we certainly know that Paul Ruzicki is not a stranger to our club. He's a retired professor of political science at Mott Community College. He came into teaching accidentally, originally planning to be a journalist, actually working for 5 years for a daily newspaper in Illinois. He has his undergraduate education from Northern Illinois, which is in DeKalb, a graduate school from Indiana University in Bloomington, and he also taught at Ball State for 2 years prior to coming to Mott Community College in 1969. In addition to teaching political science, he was faculty advisor to the student newspaper and editor of the faculty union newsletter at Mott Community College. On a regular basis, Paul is the political analyst of choice across a variety of media outlets in our area. He's also been a weekly commentator on radio shows, including the Tom Sumner Show, and often moderates candidate panels in the community, and is a regular columnist for the East Village magazine, and I believe is president of the East Village magazine board, if that's still accurate. So someone who's not a stranger to our club, who we're familiar with and we love hearing from. We're actually going to hear from again later this month on a different topic. But today we will hear from Paul Ruzicki. And Paul, the floor is yours.
Good, thank you, Kyle. Good to see everybody again, even on Zoom. It's a little unusual and all that, but I think it works out pretty well. Today, what I want to do is talk about the controversy we've had about all the voting and the voting restrictions that are out there. And I'm going to talk a little bit, first of all, about the history of it, how it all expanded over time, and then where we are today in some ways, and then some of the implications of it in the future, because there could be a few surprises there as well. Periodically, I've done little workshops for Inez Brown for some of their for poll workers. And as I go into the city hall chambers, they'd fill the whole chamber with their workers and their volunteers. And I was struck by the fact that almost always when I'm doing that, I look at the audience, and almost nobody, or very few people in the audience would be eligible to vote in 1789. In 1789, when we first, had the Constitution and all of that, by most estimates, maybe 10% of the public could vote. The idea was that before you could vote in those days, there had to be 5 things true about you. Had to be an adult, white, male, who owned property, and in many states, the right religion. If any one of those things was not true about you, you couldn't vote. So as I say, by most guesses, maybe 10% of the adult population even had the right to vote in 1789. And I might add, some states even have some of those provisions still in their constitutions. They're not applicable anymore, but it's about 8 states still have some religious test stuck away in their constitution that has been unenforceable for more than half a century. Now, those began to change over time. By the 1820s and 1830s, most of the religious tests and the property tests were gone. So again, adult white males, for the most part, could vote. And then with the 15th Amendment and the end of the Civil War, Black males could vote, at least for a short time. Beginning in 1865 till about 1877, there is a good deal of black male voting, and you do see African Americans elected to Congress, to the U.S. Senate, state legislatures in the Old South for about a dozen years. But that only lasted a dozen years. By 1876 or so, 76, 77, we see the end of Reconstruction. And ironically, in what may be, when we talk about corrupt elections, what may have been our most fouled up election was the one in 1876, when there was all kind of squabbles about who won and who lost. But the upshot of it all was that a deal was made to give the Republicans the White House if they would end Reconstruction, if they would pull the Northern troops out of the South and turn the governments of the South back over to Southern states. And once that happened, then you saw the age of Jim Crow, which effectively denied African American votes up until about 1964. And the techniques that were used in some ways were, in their own bizarre way, kind of fascinating. I mean, the limits on Black voting included things like the literacy test. And in the abstract, a literacy test in and of itself is perhaps not a terrible idea. You ought to be able to read and write and understand things to vote. But the idea was that clearly the ex-slaves who were voting in the 1870s often did not read and write well. That was illegal during slavery times. But there was a problem because there were an awful lot of white voters who couldn't read and write very well either. So if you're going to have a literacy test, aren't you going to kick out an awful lot of white voters too? So what they did, they added something kind of curious, a grandfather clause. And what the grandfather clause said was that if your grandfather could vote before 1865, you didn't have to take the test. But if your grandfather couldn't vote, then you did. So that meant obviously only African Americans had to take the test. And these things were designed so nobody could pass them. I used to have in class, I used to have a copy of a literacy test used in Alabama up through the 1960s. And it was about 68 or 70 questions that would have been tough for any kind of Jeopardy contest. I mean, they were specific things about the federal budget, details about the US Constitution that I had to look up to double check. And then on top of that, there were also kind of vague questions that anybody could sort of miss. They would ask people like, well, what is the purpose of the US of the Alabama Constitution? Well, there's a lot of purposes, but the local county clerk would decide whether or not your answer was good enough. So again, the obvious answer was an awful lot of folks failed the literacy test. On top of that, there were poll taxes. You had to pay it was common to pay a small tax, often $1 or $2, for the right to vote. And again, the local county clerks could decide to waive that for some people, but not for others. And again, it wasn't a lot of money, but there was one catch to that as well. Because if you hadn't voted for a while, you had to pay all your past poll taxes. So let's say you're an African-American voter who's finally gotten the vote, let's say in 1890 or 1900. And they say, well, Mr. Jones, that's fine. Now you got to pay your poll tax. But you haven't voted since 1865, is that correct? Oh, well, in that case, you owe us, all this money now for the poll tax. So the poll tax was another barrier that was very effective in preventing African-American voting. And then on top of all the legal stuff, there was, of course, the violence, the Klan, and things like that that prevented black voting. So the bottom line was that for the longest time in the Deep South, there was almost no or very little black voting. You could find counties where 50% of the population was African American, and there was 2% of them were voters. So as I say, it was effectively preventing nearly all black voting up until about 1964. Now, taking things along in line, I'll get to the 64 bill in a second, but 1920, we expand the vote one more time with women's right to vote nationwide. A number of states had done it a bit earlier, but by 1920, nationwide, women get the right to vote. And that struggle had gone on for almost a half a century before that took place with the 19th Amendment. What was interesting about that, though, is that when women got the right to vote in 1920, it didn't change elections much. For the longest time, women voted just about the same way men did. It changed about 1980 a bit with the early Reagan years. But up until about 1980, there wasn't that much difference in terms of male and female voters. And then kind of taking things down the line historically, in 1924, Native Americans become citizens and get the right to vote as well. They had been generally denied that right to vote in most states before 1924. And then in 1964, we finally get the Voting Rights Act as part of the whole civil rights movement of that time. And now you have federal power to step in and to really ensure that African Americans get the right to vote, particularly in those states where there's been a long history of denial of the right to vote. They banned the literacy test, poll taxes were out. The states that had a long history of discrimination in voting had to get what's called pre-clearance before they changed voting districts or changed their voting rules or changed polling places. They had to get federal approval to do that because there were all kind of games beyond the ones I've mentioned that were used to prevent African American voting. So that was in place, that pre-clearance was in place up until just a few years ago with the Voting Rights Act. And what you saw with the Voting Rights Act was a dramatic change in the number of voters, African American voters who were there, the number of elected African American candidates, both in the South and in the North as well. it really was a sea change in our political life with the Voting Rights Act. And then in terms of the history of it all, by 1972, 18-year-olds get the right to vote as well. So I say it's been a long struggle. We started off with just a small handful of the population being able to vote. Now we're at the point where essentially everybody over the age of 18 does have at least the right to vote. Now, whether they do it or not is something else again. Over the last roughly half century, the average turnout for presidential elections has been about 55, 60%. And that's our best turnout. You get a midterm election like we're going to have next year, probably will hit nationwide, will hit probably around 45, 50% turnout. And you get some local elections. We've seen these here in Flint, especially some local elections for August primaries. We're lucky if we hit 10%. So as I say, among democratic countries, we have a fairly low voter turnout, somewhere in that 60% range for our biggest elections. However, that did change a bit with 2020 because of COVID and the, I think really two reasons, because of the COVID epidemic on one hand, and the sharp partisan divide with Donald Trump out there on the ticket. We saw a significant increase in voting turnout in 2020, up to almost 70% nationwide from 2016. And in Michigan, we went up from 62% to 71% from 2016 to 2020. So a dramatic increase in the number of voters. As I say, I think it was due in part because of just the divisive nature of the election. But I think because of the COVID and because absentee voting became easier, that too played a role in increasing our turnout. The bottom line of it all, when the election was all said and done, of course, was that Trump lost by substantial margins, 74 million votes to 61 million votes, somewhat closer electoral college with a few close states. And then we saw the January 6th insurrection based upon the idea that somehow this election was stolen, that somehow Trump had all these ballots stashed away someplace that were stolen from him. And that still continues today. You still hear an awful lot of that. And I think that idea that somehow this was a dishonest, stolen election is what's fueled so much of the talk about changing the rules about voting and tightening up the voting rules and all the rest. So, and I'll be touching upon that as we go along here. Now, there's a lot of pushback in all states. Almost 47 states began some kind of a pushback, nearly all along partisan lines. It was the Republicans in large part who wanted to limit voting in a variety of ways, limit Sunday voting, which many states allowed, reduce the number of drop boxes in most states, limit early voting, limit the times you could register, limit or prohibit student voting on campuses. And then even some states like Georgia prohibited giving food or drink to voters who were in line waiting to vote. So there were a lot of details, but the bottom line was they wanted to make it a good deal tougher to go out there and vote. And now in Michigan, we've seen a similar kind of thing on two levels here in the last few years, in the last year or so. Proposal 3 of 2018 gave Michigan, as we mentioned before, the right to vote absentee for everyone. It used to be you had to be over a certain age, or you had to have medical issues or be out of town to vote absentee. Now anybody who feels like it can vote absentee as they see fit, and that played a big role in 2020. And I'm gonna add a little sidebar here that I mentioned in the breakout room. You know, I had, before this past year, I had never voted absentee except one time, and I always enjoy kind of the camaraderie of walking through the poll lines and talking to the workers and doing the election day thing. But I've come to really appreciate absentee voting in a different light within the last year for a number of reasons. And I think we ought to consider it, as I say, maybe even in a larger context in the future. I think the main advantage of absentee voting is not only does it give people who have got a tight work schedule a chance to vote and things of that nature, but in particular, it gives people a chance to become more informed voters. You know, I'm struck by the fact that for those of us who are kind of political junkies, you know, we study the candidates, we've heard about proposals and all that, but for the average voter who's not, a political nerd of some kind, they walk into the voting booth and they know who they're going to vote for president, or maybe for governor, or maybe for the Senate. But then they take a look and they see somebody running for the school board or the township board. And they say, who are these people? They never heard of them. Or they see a ballot proposal of, 2 or 3 paragraphs on some bond issue or millage that they hadn't heard about before. And they're in the voting booth for 5 or 10 minutes. They got to figure out what to do about this stuff. Well, if you have an absentee ballot and you see something and you're not sure who your township board people are, you can look it up and learn more about them. If you're not sure what a ballot proposal is about, you can study up on it and become a more informed voter. So I think there's a real advantage in that sense for the absentee vote, for voters themselves who are not following all this stuff on a day-to-day basis, to really become better and better informed voters. The other advantage too, besides just dealing with complex work situations and all that, is that it gives you a paper ballot. For all the talk about the old voter fraud and everything else, one thing all the folks say is that if you want to avoid voter fraud, is having a paper ballot there is important, more so than a pure computer. And a mail-in ballot does give you a paper ballot. One other thought, as we were just talking in the breakout room earlier, I've thought about all the work that the election workers go through on election day. They or somebody's got to take out all this equipment from the storage room, move it to all these school rooms and churches and other assembly halls around the county, set up the equipment, make sure it works, get the tables, the chairs, and all the employees there for one day. And they're there from 7 o'clock in the morning to 8 o'clock at night, and then they got to go out and count all the ballots. It might be dramatically more efficient if you simply had all that stuff mailed into one single permanent location, rather than having to drag these things all over the county every couple of months for some election. Again, I'm not sure it's ever going to happen, but I think the more I thought about it, the more I see some real advantages in both the logistics and for the voters and absentee voting. Now, in Michigan, there are attempts to limit a lot of voting. And there's 2 things happening. There's a bill in the legislature right now that would limit the voting, and there's an almost identical bill that could go to the voters in the future. A proposal called Secure the Vote is going to be out there, is going to try and get some 340,000 signatures. And what it would do basically is, now there's a lot of details to this, but let me give you a couple of key points. This proposal, again, both the one in the legislature now and the one going to the voters potentially, would require a voter ID, and which we require anyhow. That wouldn't change anything there. But it would eliminate the affidavit for those who didn't have an ID. Here's the way it works now. If you walk in to vote now and you don't have an ID, you can sign out an affidavit, say, I swear I am Paul Rozicki, and under penalty of law and so forth and so on, and that my vote's going to be counted. With this new law, if I didn't have the ID, I would then have to, within the next 6 days, go down to the county clerk's office, give them my ID before my vote could be counted. And my guess is not a lot of folks who do that are not going to get in the car and drive down to the clerk's office 6 days after the election to do that. So it would effectively make it very tough to vote without an ID. So again, those provisional ballots, as they were called, would very likely be reduced dramatically, if not rather totally eliminated. It would also ban the election officials from sending out unsolicited absentee ballot requests. We talked in the breakout room. The Secretary of State now can send out requests for ballots. Now, not the ballots themselves. These are just requests. And frankly, I've gotten those from candidates as well. It's not just the Secretary of State who does that. But this would now ban those unannounced requests from individuals. It would also modify how local governments could choose polling places. It would limit their ability to choose polling places and might limit polling places in drop boxes in various parts around the state. It would also take care of a few things that are already law today. It would ban third-party access to the qualified voter file. That's not even allowed now, but that's in that existing law. And election officials could not accept private funds, including federal funds, to supplement their budget. that could be a big issue because, again, one issue local clerks have had is as these rules have changed, especially during the pandemic, they have needed more funds to adjust to all these changing conditions. So, I mean, the bottom line is both of these things, all of these things would make it much tougher to cast your ballot in Michigan. Now, here's what's happening here is that, as I say, the legislature right now has passed a bill, the Senate has passed a bill incorporating all these ideas. It's going to go to the House. It will probably pass there, but it's going to, as a traditional law, it's got to be signed by the governor. And the odds are all but certain she would veto it. So to get around that, what they're doing is they're passing an initiative proposal. This thing that we would require 340,000 signatures would be an initiative that would potentially go on the ballot. But in Michigan, we've got an unusual provision for initiatives. If the legislature wants to, if there's an initiative in the pipeline, they can choose to act first and pass that initiative without it going to the voters. And if they do that, it does not require the governor's signature. So as a way to work around the governor, the legislature could, if this gets enough signatures, if it gets to 340,000, the legislature could pass this, and then it would become law without the signature, without the veto of the governor. So that looks like it's in the pipeline as well. It's not quite out there yet getting signatures, but it looks like it may well in the near future. So the bottom line is that we're going to see some of these kind of things in the pipeline in Michigan talked about that may modify our voting procedures in the months and years to come. The bottom line of all this, though, I think the strangest thing is this: is that the impact of all these limits would have greater impact probably on minorities where voting has been down in the past, although not so much in 2020. And maybe the older population as well. But the funny thing is that all of this is happening at a time after the 2000 election, for all the controversy we've had about stolen election and fraudulent votes and things of that nature. I've argued for a long time that the 2020 election is probably the most honest election we've ever had in this country. We've had more than 60 court cases and court rulings which have upheld the election by both Republican and Democratic judges all across the nation. We've had many states audits, recount the votes 2 and 3 times, and none of those found any significant error. For all the rumors you hear about, stuffed ballot boxes or ballots found in some riverbed somewhere, none of those things ever panned out to be true. Where there were mistakes, and there were some made here and there always are when the nation of 300 million people, they were corrected fairly quickly. And where there were attempts at cheating, and there were a few attempts at that where people were caught, but then the strangest one I came across one time was there was a guy in Colorado who, in 2020, who tried to vote twice. He voted for himself, and then he voted for his wife who had died. The problem was his wife was murdered, and he was charged with murdering his wife. So, and he was a Trump voter, wanted to give Trump an extra vote. So yeah, there were a few bizarre cases like that, but nothing of any great consequence, not enough to change any votes anywhere all over the place. So as I say, I would argue that compared to any other election, because of all the double and triple checking and everything else, this is probably has been the most honest election we've ever had in our country. And then on top of that is that I think there may be some unintended consequences to all of this. Historically, the absentee voting has long been a more Republican vote. So it began in large part because it's been an older population. But if you make absentee voting more difficult, it might help the Democrats, would have helped them in 2020. But in the long run, it may not. It may work for Republicans. May work to help Republicans. May work to hurt Republicans if you limit the absentee vote. So ironically, while it's Republicans who are pushing this, it may work to their detriment if they limit the absentee vote. The other thing is that here and there's also evidence that with all the talk about limiting the vote and preventing folks from voting, here and there, it's not universal, but here and there's some evidence that it may actually encourage folks to vote. You know, people say, you tell me I can't vote, by God, I'm going to vote. Even people who normally wouldn't vote got out there and voted. There was some evidence in North Carolina when they tried to limit the voting a few years back in this way, that at least in many areas, the voting turnout actually jumped up a little bit. So there may be that ironic spin-off there that may actually increase the turnout among those who feel they're being elbowed aside in some way. You know, having said that, though, I think the real issue here with above and beyond all the nuts and bolts of the voting is that this really increases a loss in trust in the election process. And that may be the most serious damage we're doing to the whole election system. You know, the key vote of any democracy is we have to trust the voting process. If we don't trust that, not much else is going to work. And with all this discussion about voter fraud and fixed elections and everything else, there's certainly a lot more people who are expressing distrust in the voting process. That may be the real damage, more so than whether it helps Biden or Trump or any other individual, is that may be the long-term damage, is the real distrust in the process. And maybe a kind of a final thought, as we saw this a very high turnout in the 2020 election. And in general, we'd look upon that as a good sign. However, in one sense, if you look back historically, and even in 2020, the high turnout is always tied to deep division. Some of the highest turnout we ever had in this country was just before the Civil War. Everybody was voting then because they were getting ready for a civil war. And as I say, with the deep divisions we've seen in the recent years, we saw some of our highest turnouts around in 2020. So it may not always be a great sign, but that's where we are right now. And as I say, I think we're going to see a lot more discussion about the attempts to limit voting and make voting a bit more difficult in the years to come. So any questions at all beyond that, feel free to go ahead.
I've got a question.
Sure, Joel.
So thank you, Paul, for that great presentation. And Joel, you will have the first question. It's not the first time you've asked Paul a question, I know. So.
Oh no, I've asked him questions for many years.
That's right.
When I was a reporter, and I'm looking behind you there, Paul, and I can see all those buttons. So I'm guessing.
Well, I collect all this kind of stuff. I got this is my study, and I got all my political buttons and flyers all over the place.
A lot of stories there. Go back though, Paul, to voter ID. I want to get this clear in my brain. Under the current scenario, well, we'll admit the vast majority of voters have an ID, show it, and it's the end of the story, right?
That's true.
So we're really talking about a very slim margin of people who, for whatever reason, don't have an ID. And under the current scenario, when they don't have an ID, what happens?
Under they say sign an affidavit. They say I swear I am Paul Ruzicki, and under penalty of law. That's it. And then if I sign the affidavit, my vote gets counted. Under the new law, that person would have to go to the county clerk 6 days later and present an ID of some kind, whether it's a driver's license or I think they would also accept a tax bill or a utility bill of some kind as well. But you'd have to personally go down to the clerk's office some days after the election.
And is that the gist of what this whole measure is about?
I think so. I think that's the large part. I think some of the other things too are attempts to limit, like I said, the drop boxes around the cities. There are some limits on those. I think another big issue that I see is this idea to limit the mailing out of unsolicited absentee requests. Mm-hmm. That was a fairly new thing in Michigan for the Secretary of State, and that would prohibit that. And I say that the image had long been that somehow they were mailing out ballots, but no, these are just requests for ballots that go out to all voters if you want to vote absentee. And that would limit that. And that might also reduce the absentee voter as well. If those didn't go out, people might find it easier to forget about voting.
Thank you.
Great answer. Additional questions for Paul?
Anything else there?
Paul, one question I have, because I noticed in the German election that they had a few weeks ago, they voted on Sunday. And our elections are on Tuesdays, which I've heard before had something to do with when we were farmers and, you didn't want to vote on Sunday, you didn't want to vote on Friday because you had to go to the market and took a day to get into town or something. I don't know if that's true or not, but that's what I've heard before. But The fact that we have a one-day election setting aside absentee on a day that most people working or have a kid or grandkid in school, or, I don't know if there's ever been any talk about moving our elections to a weekend where it's more convenient.
Yeah,
If people don't want
that's a good
expanded
point.
absentee.
Yeah, again, a good many other countries have used either a weekend day or sometimes the whole weekend. There are some countries that will have 2 days, Saturday morning at 12:01 till Sunday night at midnight. You can vote for some countries as well. And we are a little bit unusual in not only plugging it into a weekday, but a weekday which is generally not a holiday. I mean, some areas some workers give you a day off, but for the most part, it's a work day for the average person. And again, depending on your work schedule and a lot of other things, it can be very tough for some people just to get to the polls between 7 o'clock in the morning and 8 o'clock at night. So I think there's a lot to be said for if we're going to retain the public voting option. And again, while I like the absentee voting and for some reasons, I do like the ritual and the ceremony of the public voting in a lot of ways too. But I think there's a lot to be said for doing it on a different day or on a weekend, Saturday, Sunday would make an awful lot of sense.
Although I did appreciate Minnesota has a caucus for president like Iowa does. And so on caucus night, they canceled class at college. And so I appreciated that, having class canceled, and I went to the caucus instead of going to my evening class.
Yeah, those caucuses get kind of complicated. That's true.
Yeah, but I appreciated having class canceled. I heard another question. Sorry.
Yeah, I have a question. Yeah,
Jerry and then Jim, and then Dr. Schick.
Paul, I have an observation. The absentee ballot, anything that restricts the use of the absentee ballot, and that they can process it that many days prior to the election, I think is going to have a bigger impact than maybe some of the other things you're talking about, because I think more absentee ballots were processed, and I think it helped in getting the 91 million and the 72 million votes that were given.
Yeah, I think that helps as well. And what's interesting too is the wider use of the absentee ballot also has changed campaigning. In other words, in the past, candidates would assume that the last day for your campaign was election day. Well, now when you can vote several weeks or even almost a month early, the candidates themselves have got to adjust their campaigns to get their message out a little bit earlier than they used to as well.
Paul? Jim Richardson.
Hey, Jim.
I wondered if you might comment about some states that use only absentee balloting. For example, Oregon.
Right.
It's now had, decade or better?
Yeah.
In this arena.
Yeah. There are some, as you say, some states, Oregon in particular, does that. They have seen what's surprising there is they have seen some increase in turnout, but not a dramatic one. But they've had no serious evidence of any kind of fraud or problems, and they have made it work very, very well. As I say, when we were in the breakout rooms, there was somebody there who was an election worker, and I just thought about the logistics of what we go through to have a public vote of this dragging all this equipment around. And it occurs to me that a pure absentee ballot election might not be a terrible idea. As I say, even though I kind of like the ritual of going to the polls and all that kind of stuff, in terms of the practicalities of it, I'm often struck by the fact how the election workers who have worked from 7 in the morning to 8 o'clock at night then have to go to start counting the ballots till midnight or 3 o'clock in the morning after these excruciatingly long days. It might be much more efficient to have a permanent place where those ballots go and where you can have the equipment all set up and ready to go, and people aren't working 20-hour days to count the ballots.
Dr. Schick, I think you had a question.
Yes, Paul, I listened to everything you're saying, and I have some concerns about some of them. The absentee balloting is something that my wife and I have been doing since we were 65 years old. We're 90 and 91 now. The absentee ballot, you have to request the ballot. They then send the ballot to you. They know who you are.
Right.
They have your information. You have your signature. And you have to sign it, send it back in. And that is a very honest way, accurate way, in a way that's difficult for anybody to have fraudulent activity. Now, some of the things the Democrats were proposing in this last election, they mailed out millions at times ballots without any requests. And they were sending those ballots out to all kinds of dead people and even animals. And this is factually reported, I think, and I think it's accurate. The most important thing in my mind is to have an honest election in all regards and as easy as possible for everybody. And the mailing in, I think, is one of the best there is when it's handled just like they do now. You request it, it's sent to you, they've got your signature, and when you send it back in, you have to sign it. That way, it prevents fraud completely in those people voting that way. Now, what do you think about those proposals that have not been accepted, where in the 2020 election, they sent out a gazillion amount of ballots. And they also, at that time, I think, had the ability for other people to turn ballots in. Those kinds of things provide the potential for fraudulent activity. And I'm concerned about any kind of fraudulent activity, but I'm also concerned about easy to vote. And
Hey, this is Dr. Sheik, this is Lynetta. I don't mean to interrupt you. Paul will answer, but you know I love you. But I take great exception to what proof do you have that ballots were mailed to animals? I'm just blown away by that. So yeah, please provide your proof. But look, it's like combustion. I couldn't sit here any longer to hear that. And you know, you and I banter about
when you do that,
outlandish.
could you also just expound on ballots versus ballot applications? I think
they were requests for ballots. Again, as far as I know, there were no ballots mailed out en masse. These were requests. And again, sometimes the mailing lists were wrong, but they were requests. There's no serious evidence that the ballots themselves actually went to dead people, animals, your dog, your cat, or anything else. Now it's true in some counties, the voting lists may not be updated, and so the requests might have been mailed out, but none of the ballots did. So it's the requests again. There were stories about that, but for all the double and triple checking, there was never any evidence of any significant amount of that kind of thing happening.
In California, you think that's correct?
I'm sorry?
In California, you think there weren't ballots mailed out that were not requested?
As far as I know, no. There were requests for the ballots, but not the ballots themselves.
Well, I heard in multiple reports on television that there were a lot of ballots mailed out that were never requested.
Yeah, again, I've heard those stories too, but again, they've double and triple checked so many of these elections, and then there's no evidence that any of that ever happened much. There were stories to that effect. I think in most cases, those who were saying they were talking about the request for the ballots, not the ballots themselves.
I hope you're right, and I hope Lynetta was correct in her comment about my comments, because I think some of those things did occur.
I worked on the presidential election primary, and if you ever worked in a voting office and a clerk's office, all the things they go through when those ballots come in, they are checked against the records, and they're also, nobody else can vote against that particular name, and the address has to agree, and all those things. So I don't see those things happening.
I think people said that ballots were sent, but they had no proof. They've double checked. Applications or requests for ballots were sent to everybody in Michigan, but they did not send ballots. And that's what you need to actually vote as a ballot. And I'm an election worker as well. We jumped through so many hoops to guarantee that the election is secure. We balance multiple times a day, and it just is a secure process in Michigan, I would say.
I agree with that completely.
Amen.
I've been involved in balloting as a worker, and I've seen what you're talking about. In Michigan, at least in our city in Grand Blanc, township of Grand Blanc, has been very accurate in what you're just saying, and that was great.
You know, I joined you Go ahead, Paul. Go ahead.
I was going to say, I was in terms of the detail that goes into some of these ballots. When I was looking at some of the votes at the election last time, I was struck by the fact that the election workers had gone through the trouble of taking a look at absentee ballots and discounting those individuals who had died before the election day. So somebody voted on October 15th and died a week later. They paid attention to that, and their votes were pulled from the vote totals. And that was kind of a small detail, but that's the kind of detail that people were going through to make sure that the votes were officially counted.
Very good.
Yeah. Well, Paul, I thank you for this informative presentation. I think that we all hopefully learned some history. We're more informed about our current voting laws and what's being proposed here in Michigan and around the country. Thank you very much.
Certainly.
I want to thank again Richard Gibbs for your truly inspirational message. Special thanks to Jerry Hill and Rob Jewell working behind the scenes to coordinate Paul's presentation and were great help to me as we were getting the meeting set up. And also special thanks to Jerry Noodle for taking our meeting notes. There was a lot to take notes on, Jerry, so hope you took good notes.
Jerry's taking over.
Please join us next Friday for a hybrid. I had to change the script. Hybrid meeting, in person and virtual, with Flint Rotarian and author of Michiganians You Should Know, plus some you don't know and why. Our own Michael J. Thorpe and Michael J.
Hey, can I correct that?
I was going to ask you if you're also talking about Michiganders as well.
And I'll tell you why I call them Michiganians, but it's Michiganians You Should Know, plus some you do and don't know why.
Oh, you know what? I have it right on the screen and I read it wrong. So thank you for the correction, Michael J. Yep.
See you next week.
Yeah, absolutely. And some Michiganders to boot. There's always a lively Twitter debate on Michiganians versus Michiganders. I like that. So.
Hello, Michael.
Please remember as you go about your day, your weekend, and next week to serve to change lives. And we are adjourned.
Thank you,
you
Paul.
all.
Thank you, Paul.
Thank you.
Bye all. Thanks, Paul.
Hi. Hello, Reverend Jim. Your mic is off. It's okay.
How are you?
Good. How are you doing?
Pretty good.
Good.
Excellent. So
All right.
nice to see you.
Nice to see all of you.
Yes.
Oh, you know, I just thought about we have two Reverend
Reg?
Jims on the call. We have two Reverend Jims.
Oh, hi, Reverend Jim. That's right.
Hello.
Hello. I was talking to Reverend Jim up here.
There you go.
And he's the only Baptist I know that had bingo in his church due to my influence. due to my influence.
You have to switch to being Catholic then. It's only a Catholic game.
All right.
I get more trouble for dealing with Southern Baptists than I do with Catholics.
Oh, there you go.
I keep on doing what I believe I should do, whether I get along with them or not.
I hear you.
I think my problem was not a problem, but I think my relationship with both Robert Sabilsky has to do with the fact that we don't get along.
Well, that's all right. That's all
Yeah,
right.
that's all right.
Have a good week, you guys.
Guess what? I should
Take
tell
care.
you guys when
Jerry.
we go back to food bank. There's one guy who I don't get along with, and now I'm going to have to depend on them for transportation. That's
I know.
You get to know them better.
And
I don't know if you want to know him better. We'll try that.
well, that's it. Goodbye.
Bye.
All right, see everybody. Have a good weekend.
All right. Bye-bye.
Let me shut you down.